across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good evening, it's Friday the 6th of June, and yes, it's really me, Peter Barnes, is in the presenter's chair for the political asylum. No, you haven't sat on the remote. Kevin O'Sullivan's off doing his best runaway bride, and I've been left holding the mic. It is an honour to sit in this chair, and I cannot wait to share the next 2 hours with you, so thank you all for tuning in. Now, tonight's show does have a theme, and that is breakups. Has anybody else noticed that British politics looks less like Love Actually and more like the Lonely Hearts Club right now? Everybody's swiping left, and it's table for one. Take Reform UK, for example, pulling itself apart yet again. Zia Youssef gone, another breaker on an already crumbling love shack, while the Faragists are stuck on It's Complicated. Rupert Lowe's firing off tweets like an ex who won't let it go. But no amount of online flirting will save what I think is the party halfway out the door. Rachel Reeves, she's another one, learning that all mistakes don't stay buried. Labour's left is back at the table, red lines drawn, and the ship is sinking like the Titanic. But is she got to get on the lifeboat? Well, the problem is when it's women and children first, the Labour Party don't know what a woman is, and the boats are full of asylum seekers. So she's pretty much done with that one. There's a good evacuation plan. And then there's the relationship you just can't shake. The European Convention on Human Rights. The ECHR is that clingy ex you thought you'd moved on from, and yet there they are at 3 a.m. sliding right into your DMs. You know, this at some point we have to start wondering, is this situationship really worth it, and is the toxic relationship going to end? Enter Kemi Badenoch, you know, mid-political crisis, trying to woo the Tory vote back and keep the party together as even more MPs threaten divorce. She's announced a committee into leaving the ECHR. You know, is this really the way forward, or are we going to do a proper breakup where we delete the numbers, block them on social media, and we change the locks? Because let's be honest, this situationship, that one's definitely not working either. Across the pond, even there, all is not well. The political bromance between Elon Musk and Donald Trump is hitting another rough patch. They're trying to reconcile, apparently, but from the outside looks more like couples counselling than a great political reunion. The MAGA movement itself is looking less serious by the day. It's more beauty school dropout. Plenty of flashy promises, no clear plan, and half the movement are somewhere left at the drive-in. And if you ask Musk, where he's channeling his inner Rizzo tonight, he might as well say there are worse things I can do than go with a Doge or two. Though, judging by Trump's reaction, Musk might also say you can keep your filthy paws off my Doge-saved drawers. Well, we'll dive into all of that, ask what happens next with a man who knows exactly how these never-ending love stories play out, and that's with the great Rick Gates, the former Trump campaign manager. He's joining us later on. Back at home, one political relationship really hitting the rocks this week is Keir Starmer's courtship of the Muslim vote. Yes, it's this lingering story in the background is back again. Picture it, Starmer's out there with a boombox, say anything style, but the window stays firmly shut. You know, a new survey of Muslim Labour officials shows a growing disillusionment and serious demands for policy change. You know, it's starting to look like Julia Roberts a little bit, isn't it? I'm just a PM standing in front of a community asking it to vote for me. But the trouble is, the community's already swiped right on somebody else. Let's find out who later on. At this point, Labour, despite the rather shocking victory in Scotland, is starting to resemble how to lose a voter in 10 days. I am making many a reference here, I'm very aware of it. But this is the start of a beautiful friendship, and I want to hear what you out there think about all of these stories tonight. So is it from reforms, breakup blues to Keir Starmer's moves? The phone lines are open. Pick up the phone and dial 0344 499 1000, or you can leave us a WhatsApp, a text message. Don't forget to start with talk. Keep it clean and snappy. We don't need another podcast. Thank you. And through all of this, I just have to say I've got my girl Friday, and she's all that. I'm joined by political commentator Chloe Dobbs. Chloe, thank you so much for joining us. It's a great pleasure to be here and sharing this debut for me.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here for your debut. Momentous day.
I know, yeah. Not to lie, a little nervous, so please do bear with me, everybody. There might be a few bumps along the way, but I'm sure we'll muddle our way through. But I do want to jump straight in, because there was this story, I don't know if you saw it, about this asylum seeker from Somalia. Do you know, this is yet another one of these cases where, you know, it's a failed asylum seeker. The Home Office have tried to deport them, and it's been blocked by a High Court judge again. I think it's like the second or third time. And, you know, he's been allowed to stay in the country because he's a part of a minority, and it's against Article 3 of the ECHR. Where do you stand on the ECHR? I have a feeling I might know the answer, but I'm going to say you're probably not a fan.
I'm not a huge fan, and I think that cases particularly like this, when people in this country, especially people that live in London, are absolutely seething about the level of knife crime, finding out we can't get someone out of this country who is a knife-wielding Somalian migrant, that seems absolutely beyond belief. I think Kemi Badenoch, when she ran her leadership campaign, I think she was right to say that leaving the ECHR is not going to be a silver bullet to all our problems. One thing I'll also say is, don't expect leaving the ECHR, if we do go down that route, to be something we can just do at the snap of the fingers. We'll have to, of course, come up with our own human rights bill and go through that with a fine-tooth comb, and, you know, look how long and painstaking the negotiations were to leave the European Union. So I'm not saying this is something that's going to be easy. I think that one thing we definitely should be doing is, like many other countries do, just start ignoring the ECHR. There are nearly 10,000 ECHR judgments that have been ignored. France has done it to get rid of terrorists, for example, out of their country. Why aren't we doing the same? Why aren't we saying, I'm sorry, that's crazy if you're using ECHR Article 8 or Article 3 or whatever it is in this case, to keep someone who is running around the streets with a knife in this country. We'll just ignore it and we'll just deport him. That is because he's leaving the ECHR. God knows how long that will take and how complicated it will be. Why don't we start doing that as a short-term solution? That's what I'd say. And I think it's good that Kemi Badenoch is starting to say something. She's not 100% committed, but I think there's been a lot of frustration with Kemi Badenoch in that she's been in her post as leader of the party for quite a while. And at the beginning she was saying, I'm not going to tell you any policies yet. We need to think these things through.
Yeah, I think that was the right approach, really.
But I think people are starting, you know, reform just keep going up and up in the polls, and it seems like the Conservatives kind of need to give us a little nugget to excite us.
Yeah, I think you're right here. What's interesting is that she's announced this big committee, but we'll get to it, because there's a bit that's just before this, and it's actually interesting that the Council of Europe, the leader of it, Alan Berset, his name is, has come out, a very rare public appearance from him, and said that the ECHR must adapt to modern realities. It's interesting how Italy have called for it, we've called for it, Denmark have now called for it. They're calling for Europe, it seems to, finally, the penny has dropped. And, you know, they're starting to wake up to the realities that this piece of legislation is not fit for purpose. It was written, in the 1950s, at a very different time, and it's being applied, I think, by activist judges, and I think it's being applied in the ways that it was never meant to do. I think we have a real problem, and me and Kevin talk about this pretty much every week, of an activist judiciary that we aren't dealing with, and we don't really in this country have any way to deal with. But bringing it to Kemi, this was an interesting speech from her, because she really has a problem within the Tory party that a lot of people don't realise, is that a lot of the kind of Remainer bit of the party has kind of drawn it as a red line that if they do leave, they're out. They're going to leave the party. So she's not only got to try and woo voters back, she's got to try and keep the party together. Why do you think the Tory party, for more than 10 minutes, can't all just agree with each other? I know Reform have got their own melodrama going on, but my Lord, will the Tories just pack it in for 10 minutes?
I know, I mean, we're all going to laugh at the Tories if they have yet another leadership election, because, I mean, that is a problem with the Tories, is they claim to be a broad church, which they are, but the problem with that is you can't get everyone to agree. You've always got divisions in the party. Look what happened with Theresa May trying to negotiate her Brexit deal, where she tried to take a middle line between what we might call a soft and a hard Brexit, and then ended up pleasing nobody. And I think that Kemi Badenoch is in this position now where she's got to decide, what track do I take the party on? Do I try and go for the typical idea of you win from the centre and move a bit more towards the left, or do I try and mimic the Reform Party?
For me, I think that's the Robert Jenrick line. Is you know, I call him Nigel Farage light. He's the Pepsi to the Coca-Cola. You know, like he's not quite the real thing, if you know what I mean.
And the slight problem with that approach is, whatever the Tories say, even if they quite like Robert Jenrick, let's say the Tories were to get into power, would they be able to get all the MPs to vote through whatever Jenrick wants to do? B, they cannot really be trusted because of their track record. They can tell us, we're gonna stop the boats, we're gonna bring immigration down, and people say, well, who are you to say that? And last of all, can never out-Farage Farage.
That's the point. Do not try to Farage the Farage. Even for me, everyone knows on this show, I am not a big Reform fan. I'm a bit of a critic of theirs. I think there is a place for them. I just think there is a problem, it's structure-wise. But the man is an operator. The man knows campaigning, and he knows the press. He knows how to play this game better than anybody else we've seen in a very, very long time. And the idea that you're going to try and out-Farage him is just nonsense. But I will say, it's interesting that she's got... So with this committee, it's headed up by the Shadow Attorney General, Lord Wolfson. He's a serious player. He's a big dog in the party, but also in the legal world. This guy knows what he's talking about, so his words will carry weight. I think that's a really smart move from her. But it's the announcement that is actually going to come on... at the party conference. So this is going to be her rallying moment. I think this is her kind of last stand. That this is going to be the moment where she kind of enters the scene, or it's final curtains. From my perspective, I think.
Yeah, and we know that at party conferences, that is where people start to have a lot of conversations. Yes. If a leader is on thin ice, that's where people start gathering together, deciding who they're going to rally behind, how they're going to forge a leadership contest.
It's so high school, isn't it? Are you backing them? You can't sit with them. Oh my God, are you sat on the popular table? You were caught talking to that person. Honestly, I tell you now, I've been going to Conservative Party conference for years. It is literally high school on steroids with a lot of free wine. It sounds like a lot of fun, but honestly, after a while, you're just like, can you just behave? I mean, it's crazy. These people want to run the country, they want to be taken seriously, and this is how they behave. I always say the one bit of Tory politics I hate is leadership elections, because it brings out the absolute worst. It really does.
And also the thing that I thought one of the many things that held back the Tory party from actually cracking on with the job is that every time they have a leadership election, especially when they're in government, is that everything else goes on hold for the duration of the leadership election. And same when they call another general election, everything goes on hold, and hence nothing in the country gets done. But back to Kemi Badenoch, this decision she's going to make at the party conference. I'm really interested to see if before that we have the ECHR start trying to change their ways in response to what the Secretary General of the Council of Europe has said. I think that's quite powerful that he's come out and said that, not just a political party on the right coming out on saying that. It's not just the UK that is frustrated about this. Europe is starting to get really overwhelmed by this migrant problem, and people are recognising that things we've had in place, like the Refugee Convention, for example, essentially saying if somebody comes who's come from a dangerous place, you have to keep them, that you can't get rid of them. If we took everybody in the world that was in danger, I'm sorry, but we just don't have space.
You can't
and
do
we're
that.
realising we are at breaking point now in Europe, and we think it's bad in the UK, but some of the countries in Europe have it a lot worse than we do.
But I think the difference with the UK is we seem to keep rolling out the red carpet. Despite the fact that we don't seem to have as many as other nations, the economic cost that it is costing the UK compared to other nations is significant. And I think it is because, like you said, we keep opening up our arms, welcoming everybody in, and then it's everybody else who has to pay for it at the end of the day. And I think it's that aspect. It's the same with the net zero point. I always make this: when people realise how much money it's costing, that's when people's opinions change. We're a very giving nation, we're a very charitable nation, we take that very seriously. But I tell you now, we have a limit, and I tell you now, we're coming right up to it, because I think the pips have squeaked.
Yeah, I think we absolutely have. I think, first of all, people are at breaking point when it comes to concerns about the safety of the country.
That's a big
and if
factor.
we see one more story of someone who has attacked a woman, someone like Abdul Azadi, that Clapham chemical attacker, someone who should have been deported but wasn't, someone being raped or whatever it is, who should have been deported but wasn't, that really infuriates people. And that's one reason why people desperately leave the ECHR. And then the cost side as well that you've said. A lot of people have said for a long time, the cost of asylum seekers is so tiny, they make up such a small proportion. But it's getting so big now when, apparently it costs us around $6 billion a year, the asylum system overall. And when we're being told, we need to freeze the pensioners so that we can save $1.5 billion a year, you think, something's not right here. Well, our priorities are not straight.
It's also the way it's jumped from what was a relatively low figure to a very big figure in such a short amount of time that is really, I think that's what really shocked people as to how much we suddenly upped the ante in terms of what we're providing. And, I think Britain, like I said, it takes its charitable status and symbol very seriously. But again, when does charity start at home? But interestingly, the Labour Party's approach with the ECHR will be a more interesting thing to see, because obviously you've got the kind of more progressive side that will love the ECHR. They think that, you know, all our rights are enshrined in it, and without it we're all going to, you know, turn into a fascist dictatorship. But then you have the red wall seat MPs, these new MPs that are going to have to go out there and defend, you know, staying in it. That's going to be very difficult. So they're going to try and introduce legislation to circumvent it. Do you think that's going to work?
I think that some of the changes that have been put forward in this white paper by the Labour Party do look promising. Now, with everything in that paper, I say, and with all the policies of the Labour Party, I say, I'll believe it when I see it.
Yes,
right? I don't think anyone after nearly a year of having Labour in government is really trusting them with what they're doing.
Trust isn't even in the same room.
I'll believe it when it's implemented. I think one thing you mentioned earlier is this problem of activist judges. So they can do what they can to try and constrain what the judges can do, but ultimately, you know, you can change the leader of the Labour Party, you can change the government, but you can't just suddenly get rid of all of these judges, right? And, you know, we've got our separation between the judiciary and government. There's only so much that we can do. So I think there's always going to be a problem there to some extent.
Yeah, but again, me and Kevin, literally, we rail against this every week, and we always say it starts back at the university level. You know, this is where that professional class is being trained to look at things in the more woke perspective. And, you know, we're starting to see the consequences of that now. But, you know, in terms of a kind of the strategy for each individual party, we're now seeing it very clear dividing lines being drawn, even so far away from for the next general election. You know, obviously Reform, clean, straight out. Tories are, you know, committee out, and then the Labour Party are dancing around it. But obviously the Lib Dems are probably doing a roly-poly somewhere, so, you know, we don't really take them seriously on this issue, which is staggering to me, considering they're third largest party, and yet they behave like that. I think is a
I'm sure
shameful.
Ed Davey will respond by a video of him.
Yeah, he'd probably be dressed as a banana trying to do some ridiculous human being. That man needs to just go away, honestly. But it is, even now, we're getting clear dividing lines being drawn by the political parties, and the ECHR, whilst it's not the most flashy bit, it's the centre of a lot of our politics now.
I think that Kemi making this announcement that we're going to look into this and then make an official announcement, that's got people talking about it now. And so I don't think this is going to go away unless there's some other huge thing in the news that distracts us all away from it.
Don't say that, honestly.
But this is definitely a discussion that is going to be ongoing. And I think the Labour Party will really struggle with this. And I think the Labour Party is struggling not just on the ECHR, but on many issues. So, you know, one thing we're going to talk about in the show is Rachel Reeves. But the problem that Keir Starmer has got is that whilst people in the party are very disgruntled with Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, a lot of them are concerned that they're not left-wing enough.
Yes.
A lot of people are saying Rachel Reeves, she needs to raise taxes more.
Yeah.
They're
Now,
not high
Chloe,
enough.
do hold that thought, because we're going to get onto that right in a minute, just after this break. So, yep, do stick with us here at Talk.
Musk is saying he is going to, in effect, take offline. You've got Steve Bannon, who, as you know, is a big supporter of President Trump, who's suggesting that Trump take over SpaceX. I'm not quite sure what the authority would be to do that, but take over the company so that that doesn't happen. This is a total mess.
Yeah.
And as I said at the beginning, you know, in terms of a tabloid type story, a sensational type story, I don't think you can beat this one, can you?
No, I don't think you can.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to the Political Asylum. I'm Peter Barnes, filling in for Kevin O'Sullivan, and I'm joined by the wonderful Chloe Dobbs, who's going to sit with me and keep me company. Now, the theme of the show is political breakups, because it is the Lonely Hearts Club here in Westminster. So the next one we're going to have to talk about is Rachel Reeves. We were just talking about it before the break, about how it's knives out and the Labour left are back with a bang. You know, they've got their red lines drawn and they are ready for battle. They have really got to push them on things like the disability cuts, the PIP payments, and so many more. Rachel Reeves is really out in the cold right now. She has very few political allies. The number 11, the Treasury, is all over the place. There seems to be a lack of coordination. And more interestingly, which I find quite fascinating, is that this is not a Chancellor and Prime Minister walking hand in hand. Normally, these two you could get a piece of paper between them in a good relationship. But the number of times Keir Starmer has hung Rachel Reeves out to dry, particularly when it comes to the performance on economic growth, which has been, let's be honest, non-existent. You know, we're starting to see a real kind of I don't know if you've ever seen the film, Chloe, but you know in Jurassic Park where there's that goat that's tied up to the stick and like it's to feed off to the T-Rex. I think that is Rachel Reeves. You've never seen it?
The last time I saw it was when I was about 5.
Really? Oh no! This is the perfect. I think it's a perfect analogy. It's this poor little goat, and the next thing you know, this giant T-Rex is just eats it. And I think that is what Keir Starmer has really set Rachel Reeves up to take in all the flack. You know, he's managed to distance himself rather perfectly from a lot of these policy disasters. But yeah, I have to admit, it's knives out, and the left are back. You know, this idea that the Corbynista call went away, and you know the soft, friendly left. I tell you now, that's not so true, is it?
No, and Keir Starmer, he did a lot of work after taking over from Corbyn to try and modernise the party, make it a little bit more centrist, and tried to try and unite the party to try and deal with the so-called anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and whatnot. But the cracks are starting to appear now, and we're starting to realise that the party is really divided. On the one hand, the Labour Party is absolutely plummeting in the polls because people are furious about tax rises and the cost of net zero and whatnot. But on the other hand, the Labour Party members are furious about the fact that taxes are not high enough.
Yeah.
And if you look at, what's really telling is if you go on the Labour list website, they've had some polling done within the members to see who is the most popular.
Oh,
and amongst the cabinet members, Ed Miliband is miles ahead of the rest of them.
Oh,
Angela
good
Rayner
God.
second, and then Rachel Reeves at the very bottom, Keir Starmer near the bottom. And so amongst the Labour members, they absolutely love net zero, and this is what their priority is. But the members of the public, they're losing votes to the Reform Party and whatnot because people are furious about the cost of net zero when they're being told, sorry, we don't have enough money for things like winter fuel payment. We've now got police chiefs all coming out and saying we need more cash to keep the streets safe, else you're not going to hit your targets to half knife crime and half violence against women and girls. else. These are things that other members of the public are absolutely furious about and concerned about, and people want net zero slash. But then within the Labour Party members, as opposed to people who might consider voting for the Labour Party as a whole, you've actually still got a very strong left-wing ideology.
Yeah, definitely. I've always said this. Just because, you know, people like Corbyn and John McDonnell aren't in the Labour Party anymore doesn't mean their influence isn't felt, doesn't mean that that streak has ever disappeared. My thing with Keir Starmer is he was just better at window dressing. He was better at presenting the Labour Party as a serious political party. He just kept the lunatics away from the TV cameras. That was what it was, you know. Instead of facing the TV camera that way, he put everybody over there. It was rather ridiculous, but it worked perfectly, because I always said that the reason that the Labour Party just gained that massive majority at the last general election was a mixture of things, really, but the main one was they looked like a competent government in waiting. You know, their messaging was on point, they stayed together, but the minute they got into... They promised the world. I mean, let's be real, he lied his way into number 10.
Absolutely.
I think I go back to the Southport speech, you know, just after that he gave, when he called everyone a far-right thug. I thought that was one of the most disgraceful bits of politics I've ever seen. It was tone deaf, and I thought he weaponised the office of the Prime Minister there. I thought that was terrible. But what's interesting, again, is that Reeves... I mean, talk about, you know, not being able to tell the truth. This woman can't lie straight in bed. It's ridiculous. But, you know, she's starting to realise that she's out of her depth. She's starting to look to other people to kind of help her. But I don't know whether she's got some good advisors, because she's throwing some good punches back. You know, you see this kind of little wars between number 10 and number 11 aren't uncommon, but this is, you know, seems to be all out of turf war more than anything else.
Yeah, as I said, the party's really divided. Now, I mean, what can Keir Starmer do about this loathing of Rachel Reeves that seems to be growing? Because look at Liz Truss when she tried to throw her Chancellor under the bus so that she could, you know, get off scot-free. But it didn't really work, did it? Because we know that the Prime Minister is always, you know, the Chancellor is just like their right-hand man. They're talking constantly. You know, the Prime Minister's signed off on everything the Chancellor's done. I think it's very difficult for a Prime Minister to say, oh, sorry, that wasn't my idea, that was just their idea, and distance themselves from it.
But saying that, though, I do think that Keir Starmer has been able to do that. I think he's cemented himself perfectly. You know, every single minister is taking the rap for these failures, not Keir Starmer. Notice that we say it's Rachel Reeves' economy, not Keir Starmer's economy. We notice that it's Yvette Cooper's migrant crisis. It's not Keir Starmer. You know, there's only really one time I think I could think of Keir Starmer actually taking any blame in terms of a kind of when it comes to the migrant crisis, and that was in the recent Telegraph headline where it says that he's lost control. I never really liked that headline because it implies that he had control at some point. I always thought that was a bit of a silly headline, really. But moving on, I do think that yet again there is more political breakups here in Westminster and London, and that is reform. I know that they are your little baby more than they are mine, but the exit of Zia Youssef is, I think, a very interesting moment for reform, because this is yet again another big name leaving in not very nice circumstances, to put it nicely, and I do think there is yet again a underlying structural problem at reform, that they are missing certain people as a kind of matron, kind of you go here, you go there, and you know they're missing that kind of grip on everything, and these little moments are really going to start costing them. Maybe not at the ballot box just yet, but you start building a pattern and that competence goes clean out the window.
I think it's a shame to see Zia go, because it very much was the case until before Zia came on the scene that the Reform Party was kind of a one-man band. It was the Farage show, and that was getting him a lot of social media views and whatnot. But you actually need to build a proper party and build all the structure that you need to be able to go out and campaign at the local elections properly, like they did very recently. And Zia very much helped them get to that success that they had at those local elections by helping organise the party. I think that Zia has added a lot to the party, so even though he's gone, we've now got a decent structure in place in the party. He's now started apparently he's, you know, absolutely, he's a nerd, he's fantastic with numbers and tech, and so him starting to set up, you know, the Doge organisations in the council was good, but now they've lost that great asset who's great at organising the party and doing that sort of thing, and it was very sudden and unexpected. A lot of people were saying that this Sarah Pochin question about the burka was what triggered it. But what Nigel seems to be saying is that the day before, he could tell that Zia was in a mindset where he was just seemed like he's very over. Nigel was saying this is a 100-hour-a-week job. A lot of businessmen, they try and come into politics and realise they don't like it. When you're a businessman, yes, you may have a lot of stress going on, but you don't have constant trolls online coming after you.
They also tend to go into established political parties. You know, they've already got the structures. You know, these people have built up a company. They don't really want to then have to build up yet another thing that often is out of their wheelhouse, because politics and business, whilst have a lot of similarities, there's a very different animal. And I think I was saying to Kevin in the handover that there is thick skin and then there's Westminster thick skin. That, you know, you are going to get a barrage of abuse. You are going to get this in your face. It's not right, but it happens, and you've got to kind of, you know, either get through it or get out of the game.
And that may have got to him. And maybe he felt that he had done the bulk of the work that he needed to get the party on their feet. It's very hard to tell from his tweet whether he wants Reform to win the general election or whether he doesn't want them to win.
Now, that, I think, is very interesting, because if you are still on board, is not a good use of my time, is a very interesting ending to a tweet which is supposedly wishing a political party well. I think there is still a little bit of a kind of...
It's very ambiguous.
Yes.
Very short and sweet, that tweet.
Very. And, you know, I think there is a still, and I say this right from the beginning with Reform, there is a big kind of fissure drawing down the middle of it, and it is not necessarily, it's the Rupert Lowe's and the Ben Habibs on one side and what I've been calling the Faragists on the other, and that is starting to grow and grow and grow, and unfortunately without somebody there as a firm hand to pull this all together, I think, and I don't want it to happen, despite what many people think, but I do think that Reform are going to really suffer here, because they lack somebody who's actually good at managing people, and more importantly, managing expectations. My God, you had Zia Yusuf was running around saying, we're ready to form a government. You've got 5 MPs and you can't even control them. You know, they are running around, obviously riding a big wave in which you've got to keep the momentum going. But at some point, I do think it was really bad politics to start promising the world this early, and then whenever they suddenly had to make a little bit of a policy shift, the base went insane. Look at Tommy Robinson, Shamima Begum, look at this thing with the burka. You know, it just seems to be that these little mistakes are going to cost them, and it is the base that I think is the big problem, because it is this kind of coalition of fellow travellers that Reform are kind of building, and I think it's easy to build a kind of coalition as a populist movement. Governing with it, much different.
Yeah, I mean, I think that they are in a way better position than they were a year ago. I know some people say, oh, they only got 5 MPs. But the fact that they got as many votes as they did and got 5 MPs when they only had a few people running the show, I mean, it was absolutely crazy and absolutely phenomenal. I think they've come a heck of a long way, but they've got a heck of a long way to go. I mean, luckily, presuming that we don't have a general election until 2029, they've got time to do that, but they're going to have to find someone very capable to take that place of Zia Yusuf. It will be very interesting to see how this affects them. When Rupert Lowe left the party, if you looked at Twitter, you might have thought this is the end of the Reform Party, but then we saw the local elections and nothing really happened. My greater concern with Zia, as opposed to Rupert leaving the party, is I don't know exactly how much Zia was giving to the party, but we know he, you know, is helping financially with the party. And now what is going to happen? Is he still going to keep supporting the party financially but just doesn't want to be involved? Or is he saying, you know what, I don't like the guys anymore and I'm going to tell all my rich mates that were thinking of donating not to donate? What's going to happen from a money side? Because they need that money.
And, you know, I spoke to Alex
campaign.
Phillips about this, and she said that the money is not matching it. The promise of it is there, but you know, getting people to part with money is not an easy thing, and getting them to part with it for political parties is even harder. But anyway, we are going to take another break. Stick with us here on Talk. I'm Peter Barnes. This is the Political Asylum.
UK. On DAB+. On your smart speaker. On your smart TV. And on your side. This is Talk.
Hi, I'm Peter Barnes. Welcome back to Talk, and this is the Political Asylum. I'm joined with the wonderful Chloe Dobbs, and we are talking all things breakup here in London and in British politics. But yes, there is another lingering problem in our politics, and that is the rise of sectarianism. I hate to say it, but it is back, unfortunately, with a bang. And we've seen this kind of growing in the background of a kind of rise of the kind of pro-Gaza MPs with the start of it, and we see quite a few kind of major councillors elected under these elections, last lot of local elections as well. But let's go back to Sarah Pochian, who I thought asked a very interesting question on banning the burqa and kind of where we stand with a lot of this kind of Islamization of Britain. Let's roll that clip. This is Sarah on Drive with Kevin.
The burqa is a profoundly misogynistic item, in my view, and very offensive to our British culture. Keir Starmer himself in the last week has talked about this country being an island of strangers. Well, there's no better way to start to change that than to get rid of such items like a burqa, which is so distinctive and so divisive, and actually quite a threatening thing for British people to pass on the streets, or for children to have to come across in school, or whatever area of life it might be. I was a magistrate for 20 years, Kevin. If anybody had walked into my courts wearing such an item, proceedings would have been stopped until the item was removed.
Now, many people have said that this was a rather divisive question that she asked at Prime Minister questions. It was a very it was inappropriate, it was wrong, but I think it strikes to the very heart of a big issue we have in this country, and that is the issue of tolerance. And I think it is at the centre of so many of our issues that we face, particularly when we look at multiculturalism, the immigration issue. All of it is centred on this issue of tolerance. And unfortunately, I do believe that the United Kingdom has bent over backwards too far. And now we're seeing the kind of consequences of that play out on our streets. Let's not forget we are seeing issues of race riots in Leicester. We're seeing, all these kind of rise of, like I say, these MPs and this political force that is kind of growing in the background. But, this is just the tip of the iceberg, really, with the threat of Sharia courts has always lingered around. And I do think it is because Britain has, like I say, been a little too weak at defending itself. We have been weak at defending our values. We've been weak at defending particularly liberal education. I look at the Batley Grammar School issue. I look at the issue over, I think it was in Wakefield, where a mother had to plead with a mob not to attack her children who, were all involved, and the police were there. This was insanity to me. I go back to, I think it was in 2013, David Cameron gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. This is the same thing that J.D. Vance was at, and he gave that great speech. But David Cameron gave this speech, and it was all about standing up for our values. It was about standing up for actual liberalism, actual values that we all share, and that we all are supposed to hold us together. And unfortunately, it fell rather flat because everyone got scared of a Guardian comment piece, I imagine. But that's just British politics. But Chloe, where do you think we started with this? Because the banning the burqa thing, I do think is just the tip of the iceberg, and we're seeing all this the growth of this movement that I think the Labour Party has pandered to. But yeah, it's quite interesting, don't you think?
Yeah, and you could really hear in the chamber when Sarah asked that question, yes, the gasps, which I think showed how out of touch many MPs are with the rest of society. The rest of society is very concerned about, as you say, the fact we've bent over backwards. When it comes to tolerance, it's very easy to say, be whoever you want, say whatever you want, wear whatever you want, believe whatever you want. But I think we've started to see the consequences of, and not to be nerdy on philosophy, but Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, which is that, for those who don't understand, if you tolerate the intolerant, tolerance destroys itself. So you mentioned Batley Grammar School there. We have tolerated people with extreme Islamist views in this country, people who believe that if you do not pander to Islam and you criticise it in any way, that you should be shut down, you should be attacked, and they call for jihad on the streets of Britain, all of this sort of stuff, right? That is intolerance, and that is tolerance destroying itself, essentially. And I think that asking this question about the burqa, which I will note is typically only worn very often in Muslim countries where you've got Islamist extremists running the show. Most more moderate Muslim countries, you don't see many women wearing this.
Some have even gone out as far as to ban it themselves. You know, if you look at, I think it's nations like Cameroon, I think is one, and there's another.
There are a few countries, and I mean, Sarah pointed out the fact that there are many other countries who you wouldn't consider to be, you know, far right countries in terms of their politics have decided to do this. And there are other concerns about this burqa ban in other countries is often just wrapped in with a general rule of no covering your face in public.
I think that is a bit of a cop-out, if I'm being honest. I think that is politicians not wanting to get involved in a very dicey political issue because it is not in their favour to get involved in it. And I do think you expanding this into the all face coverings is a way of kind of having the conversation without having the conversation. I do think we need to be braver.
I do think you need to be brave to have the difficult conversation, to say, you know, to express the concern, saying, I think this is an oppression of women. I don't think this is freedom. Yes, there may be some women who genuinely decide for themselves to wear it, but we think in most cases this is being forced upon women and excluding them from socialising in societies. So, I mean, one of the things with the burqa is it makes it very hard to communicate with other people, to see their faces and to hear them properly when you've got, you know, a big piece of fabric in front of your face. What that means is that it oppresses women, and that it stops. Men don't want their wives to go out and maybe speak to other men or speak to other people. It really isolates them. I think that is oppressive. I don't think that's giving people freedom. Say, people should be free to wear whatever they want. But I feel like here you've really
it's a fine line. I've spoken about this a few times.
It's not promoting freedom.
It's not. And I don't really like the idea of telling somebody what to wear. I find that the kind of juxtaposition we find ourselves in on this one. But the one thing I will say is the tone difference in this conversation from when you had the Boris Johnson letterbox comment. You know, everybody lost their minds. There was a collective like, no, we don't say that. However, this one, the door is opened a lot wider to having this conversation in a more grown-up way, and in only a very short amount of time. I find that quite interesting, and I put that down mainly, obviously, because Reform is a dominant player. But I do think the way that it's been brought in, whilst I do think it has been sloppy, I think there's a better way to approach it to the country. I think the country's ready to have this conversation now, and I think it's because we've seen the impact of uncontrolled immigration into the United Kingdom.
Yeah, I think that there are people who have, say, either made jokes or made serious comments about their concerns about Islam growing in the past, when at the time most people thought, no, people can believe what they want, people can follow whatever religion they want, this just isn't an issue, right? Whereas now there are people thinking, actually, maybe they had a point. Maybe they had a point. And even if they don't believe exactly what you said or don't agree with someone making a joke like the letterbox joke, they think, actually, maybe the burqa's not a good idea. Maybe Islam growing at an unprecedented rate in this country isn't a great thing, because, I mean, you've just mentioned we've got a big rise in sectarian politics in this country. That is the consequence that we're seeing. We know that Muslim families have way more children than the rest of us, and then throw immigration and a low fertility rate for normal Brits into the mix.
Birth rate
and we've got society changing at a rate so fast that it means integration is difficult. And integration is particularly difficult when the people following that religion are covering themselves so that you can't interact with them in public and make friends and discuss your ideas together. So it's really bubbled up to the surface.
It really has, and I'll tell you now, there's an interesting situation that has happened where we've got the Green Party seem to be collecting up these people, but we'll get onto that just after this quick break.
will it take for the British people to actually take action on this? You know, after the Manchester Arena bombing, we thought maybe that would do it. No, we were told don't look back in anger. Then Southport happened. The people rose up, the great British people, and they were all slurred as far right, even by Keir Starmer, called criminals by the government before there was even a legal trial.
Yeah.
And now we had the report out showing that there are no far right connections to those political prisoners we have, like Lucy Connolly. Let's admit that we have political prisoners in this country. That's the reality.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Hello and welcome back to Talk. I'm Peter Barnes, filling in for Kevin O'Sullivan here on the Political Asylum. Yes, that's right, they actually left me in charge. I don't know why, but we're struggling through it the best we can, and Chloe is keeping me company, the wonderful Chloe Dobbs. Now, before the break, we were just getting on to the Green Party and how I can't help but notice they've started to attract a lot of these rather controversial figures. They seem to be very pro-Gaza, very pro-Palestine. They're all following one political trend, and, you know, the most recent one is a chap called Mothin Ali. Now, a few of you may remember him. He kind of rose to providence during the Leeds riots. You know, he was praised for his bravery, and now he's standing to be a deputy leader of the Green Party. And yeah, he is quite the controversial figure. But I want to bring in a political strategist, a good friend of mine, Sam Armstrong, into this conversation, because I think there's quite an interesting thing to go at here. Because, Sam, I don't know if you agree with me. Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining me. The Green Party is becoming somewhat of the refuge bin for every kind of, you know, controversial figure that it seems to be hanging out in British politics. What do you think?
Yeah, the cranks, weirdos and freaks that were kicked out of the Labour Party under Keir Starmer, and look, credit to the guy, he did it, have run as fast as their little legs can carry them into the Green Party. And it's a shame in a sense, because, look, the Green Party, I happen to think they're mad as a bunch of hatters, but were a proud part of the British democratic tradition. And then all of a sudden, all of these just oddballs, just bizarre people have run into them, and the Green Party have welcomed them with open arms. And we know because Mothin Ali, this strange, in my view, a man who's strayed into out and out anti-Semitism figure, is the councillor for Hare Hills in Leeds. For those people who don't know anything about Hare Hills, it is ground zero for the problems that our society is facing. This was where they had the riots last year. This is a broken, divided community. And the Green Party are sensing an opportunity. They know Keir Starmer's weak there, and they would like a big chunk of Labour's inner city vote, and they are not afraid to get into bed with the devil if that gets them there.
Yeah, I happen to agree with you. If you just look at the local elections, they secured 5% of the vote. Their actual seat share went shot up, and it was all because they went after this vote, and they like you said, they took it off the Labour Party. They took it out of the inner cities, and it really did work for them. I've always believed that the left is actually going to be the thing that brings down the Labour Party more than the right will. What I always say is a south part over a right hook. But it's quite interesting. Chloe, I want to bring you in on this, because this is a real kind of moment, I think, in our politics where we have to start standing up for our values. We have to start defending ourselves and believing in ourselves again. Where did we all go wrong in terms of just believing we're the bad guys in every situation? Because it's that has given rise to this lot.
Well, where did it all go wrong?
Yeah.
I mean, it's a difficult,
How long have we got?
it's a difficult question. I mean, we see it at universities. We see it being a consequence of mass migration. If you've got people coming this country who are either immigrants or second-generation immigrants, they're not going to be as loyal to this country as your typical Brit. And I think there's just been this ideology just spread everywhere that the West is evil. And I think it's absolutely crazy that you've got MPs like Tahir rally, for example, not someone joining the Green Party yet, but we've just had the news that the Birmingham bin strikers, they're going to carry on until Christmas, and one of the MPs in Birmingham, I thought, oh, let me just check his Twitter and see if he's talking about this, and I know he's not on the council, but you'd think that he'd be interested in it, and his last 2 posts were him standing up in the Commons talking about Gaza, saying we need to kick Israel out of the UN and whatnot, and it seems there really is a taste for this in politics at the moment, to have politicians standing up and talking about what's going on in the Middle East rather than what's happening at home. And I think that a big problem with parties like the Green Party is they are a one-trick pony. They know where they stand when it comes to the environment, but if you are a political party, you have to come up with what you think about everything else, be it the NHS, education, and it seems what's going on in the Middle East. We had the Green Party decide to vote at their party conference to declare what Israel is doing to be a genocide. But I just don't think that the Green Party... It's not really your place.
Exactly.
You're a party that's meant to be talking about the environment, but they feel they have to have a stance on everything else. And now they're attracting these nutters when they think, oh, it might get us a few more votes. We're a little party. We could do with the help.
And also, it gets some views. I just want to throw to a quick clip of this Mohsin Ali shouting some rather interesting things. Sam, I want to get your take on this. Let's roll the clip.
We will not be silent. We will raise the voice of Gaza. We will raise the voice of Palestine. Allahu Akbar.
That is an elected member of in British democracy, and yet he seems to be much more interested in what's going on in Gaza. This can't continue, can it, Sam?
Well, look, the truth is, I wish it couldn't, Peter, but look, this is a democracy, right? And there are neighbourhoods in this country that are now totally divided communities. They are places in which the majority of the residents, or at the very least a plurality, believe exactly in the kinds of things that Mohsin Ali is saying, right?
Yeah.
It's an accident that he's here. He hasn't arrived by a fluke. He is a symptom of a wider societal sickness that we have imported, willingly or unwillingly, people into this country hold a series and set of beliefs, and look, they're entitled in a sense to representation. It's like the old Eric Forth, the Tory MP said. He said there are millions of bigots in this country and they deserve representation.
No, it's interesting. You bang on. It's 100% correct. But I want to pick up on something you said about, we've allowed it to happen, because I don't know if you saw this, Chloe, I've got to get your take on this as well. This interesting clip of Dawn French, where she went on to say that the October massacre, one of the most horrific things I think we've seen in a very long time, she said, that Hamas thing. That's what she called it, that Hamas thing. These people have been culturally empowered. We raise them up, we celebrate them, and yet they come out with this absolute diatribe of just nonsense, and the consequences of it they don't see, because they're not living in Hare Hills. They're not living in these communities. They are living, in these lovely gated private streets. They're all protected with the BBC money and all the rest of it. It is absolutely despicable, and it is these people that are driving this factor. But yet it is this, again, I go back to with what you were saying, Chloe, about tolerance. We have tolerated and tolerated and tolerated, and unfortunately these people have taken not just an inch, they've taken 10 miles, and the barbarians aren't just out the door, they're through the gate at this point.
I think that when it comes to a lot of celebs, they really do live in a bubble, often quite a woke bubble, and a bubble that is completely out of touch with what is happening on the streets of Britain and what are the concerns of normal people. I mean, Gary Lineker is the perfect example of someone that lives in a woke bubble, and look what has happened to him. I mean, he was asked in an interview, oh, don't you think the BBC should present both sides when it comes to the Israel-Gaza issue? And his view is just, oh, but there only is one side. There only is one right, truthful side. They don't need to show the pro-Israel argument. Absolutely not. Because he just really lives in this complete and utter bubble, and clearly it seems like Dawn French, that has happened to her as well.
Yeah, that's right. And it is interesting, really, that, we're seeing that, like you said, you've got the Gary Lineker, you've got Dawn French, you've got a series of these people always coming out on one side. And yet anybody...
Very simplistic arguments.
That is the thing.
I think it's also because... These people aren't people who are experts at politics.
Oh, no.
We live and breathe it every day. We talk about it every day. But someone like Gary Lineker, I'm sure he is great when it comes to football. That is his expertise. He knows far more about it than me. Say whatever you want about football, Gary Lineker. When you've got him coming out with these simplistic statements, because clearly he hasn't looked into it that much, or Taylor Swift saying, oh, we all need to vote for Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, when you're good at singing, you don't know anything about politics.
Exactly.
So just, quite frankly, shut up.
Oh, yeah, and I always say...
Dawn French, amazing comedian. She's done some fantastic shows. Does she look in depth about what's going on in the Middle East every day? Probably not. I always say that you look at Hillary Clinton's campaign, I always say it's like the political acumen of Beyonce. Didn't really mean anything at the end of the day, did it? But Sam, you know, we see this again, and I want to bring back the Green Party element of it, because I always do think that, like I said, that the takedown of the Labour Party will come from the left more than the right, because just like the right, they can't get on with each other, you know. Get three leftists in a room and I'll show you 38 different opinions on something. But I do think that the Green Party has a responsibility here to start saying no. Do you know, there's multiple of these kind of people getting involved in politics, getting involved in very influential positions in local councils, because let's be real, that's where most people's direct impact of government comes across, and yet they're just welcoming them. Is it time that we start to say to the Green Party, it's time to buck up your ideas?
Well, absolutely, but look, let's be clear, it won't make the blindest bit of difference.
No, that's
true. And why? Which is, we used to have a sense as a society of what were our shared British There were things that we believed in. There was a coherent national identity and story that was drummed into us all, from knee-high as a grasshopper right the way through school, through life, to our contribution to society. It simply doesn't exist anymore. Our society has been frayed at the very edges and all the way inwards, to the extent to which you can now live parallel lives.
You're bang on, Sam. You're absolutely 100% great. These kind of parallel communities, it will be the downfall of Britain. But again, thank you so much for joining us, Sam. It is time for us to flick to the news. So do stick with us, and I will see you straight after this.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to the Political Asylum. I'm Peter Barnes, filling in for Kevin O'Sullivan while he was on drive. And yes, that's right, they left me in charge. That was 1 hour down. Thank God we got through that just about. But I just want to go through some of the messages. I just want to say thank you to everybody who has messaged saying, wishing me well, and thank you very much for tuning in. You know, there's a great team here. Samara is holding this together with Gaffer Tape and Collective Will, and Chloe is holding me together with Gaffer Tape and Collective Will as well. But honestly, just some of these comments are absolutely brilliant. You know, I look at this one from Stuart, and he says, Peter, there wasn't disbelief when the Gaza supporting MPs raised the blasphemy laws issue or an airport in Pakistan. Why is it so different when the burka ban is raised? You know, that's a good point, really. And, you know, there's an excellent one just a little bit further down talking about, well, one thing that we really need to do is start rolling back a lot of Blair's reforms. You know, the Blair years absolutely decimated the British Constitution. Yeah, I used to have a lecturer at university who said that Blair was a constitutional terrorist because of what he did setting up the Supreme Court and all this kind of quangos and all the rest of it, what they call the stakeholder society. It was, I still was still reeling with the consequences of that. But Chloe, just as a kind of overview, you know, one of the major things we've seen so far this year was the Supreme Court's ruling on what is a woman. I cannot believe it took this many people this long and cost this much amount of money to come up with what I believe is common sense. But, you know, we're starting to see certain institutions, public institutions at that, the NHS being the main driver of the trans agenda here in the UK, start to say, we're not going to do it. And everybody's going, OK, now what? I find this very, very concerning. What about you?
Well, I think that it is it's very concerning that the NHS were going down the route that they were for so long, and that it required us to go all the way to the Supreme Court to get a ruling that was just basic common sense. But I do think that it kind of needed to be done. That Equality Act was written before we had all of this talk of what is a woman. It was written at a time when we all just knew, oh, there are two genders, man and woman. We don't need to define what that is.
Do you remember when common sense was a thing?
Hence just putting the word woman in there, when all of this, you know, silly gender nonsense came about, that just left a complete vacuum for all these nutcases to say, oh yeah, of course men in frocks should be allowed in the women's bathrooms and changing rooms and prisons and whatnot. So I think that clarification was needed. The fact it needed to go to the Supreme Court all that far is completely insane, and the abuse that the amazing women who have fought this campaign and got it to the Supreme Court that they had to face is just crazy for saying what is a pretty reasonable
it's
thing.
Interesting you bring that up, actually, because I want to bring in our next guest, because I want to talk about the NHS and the issue with the trans kind of guidance. And I want to bring in Debbie Hayton. You know, she's the author of Transsexual Apostate. And, you know, Debbie, I read about some of the abuse that you were subject to for simply just having a different type of opinion than, you know, somebody in the LGBT community would supposedly have, and yet you were kind of pushed aside. You were othered by your own community. I mean, I have to admit, Debbie, I am a fan of yours. I think you're a great advocate for the actual trans community, and yet, you know, everybody else thinks, you know, you scarlet lettered more than anything.
Well, thank you very much for saying that, Peter. It's good to talk to you, and it's good to discuss these issues. I think they do need discussing, and as you said, we've always known what a woman is and what a man is. It is common sense. And the fact is that for too many years we've abandoned that common sense and led to some very absurd outcomes in recent years. And it's good that the Supreme Court has actually restored sanity to the debate.
Well, it's interesting, it restored sanity, but everybody seems to just go to say, I'm just going to ignore it. What I find interesting is the same people that over the Brexit years said that if you ignore the Supreme Court, society is going to crumble, suddenly don't seem that bothered about ignoring the Supreme Court ruling on this. You know, and it goes back to, I think, a generation of people that weren't told no as children. You know, and I think they've been pandered to, and I think there is a real problem now of activists within big public institutions using their power to ignore the Supreme Court ruling. And I look at the NHS as a prime example, and not just the institution of the NHS, but the other bodies that circulate around it. You know, you've got the British Medical Association, you've got the obstetrics departments and all the rest of it. You know, that they're not letting this go without a fight, are they?
Well, they're not. There seems to be what I would call institutional stubbornness about this. That policies have been introduced, policies which have not been thought through, have not been robust, and that organisations are not willing to just say we were wrong and come up with new policy. They're going to have to be forced into it in some cases.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was saying, but this is the NHS. This is a public body. So if the NHS doesn't roll back on these policies pretty sharpish, then they'll just end up being sued, and they're in an indefensible position. And who will end up picking up the bill for that? It will be the taxpayer.
Always. Why is it always it's always the taxpayer that ends up being done over, isn't it? But Chloe, it's interesting because on this, I've always viewed it as I think it's primarily a women's safety issue when it comes to a lot of the issues around this, and it's actually about competing rights. And actually, rights don't have to compete against each other. And there's a lot of kind of nuance in the debate that is ignored by these people screaming at, at all of these protests. But, as I hate to say this, but as a woman, it's such a patronising way to enter a sentence. But, how does it make you feel when you see all these people like screaming that, they could just say that they are one. Personally, from your experiences, because I know that you get enough of the abuse online as well. It's rather shocking.
People went absolutely crazy at me after I tweeted about a man in a frock being in the women's lose in Waterloo after the Supreme Court ruling, and I thought that most people would agree with me that this person shouldn't be in there after we clearly had that clarification from the Supreme Court. But apparently what I said was a horrible, Nazi, bigoted thing, every single name I was called right. But I feel like all of these people screaming and shouting, for me as a woman, it makes me feel really sad to think so many people fought for so many years for women to have the rights and freedoms that they have today. I can work a career, I can have a bank account in my name, I can have property in my name, not that I can afford any of it, but there's so much that I can do as a woman that I wouldn't have been able to do if I was born in an earlier time or if I was born today but in a different country. I feel so lucky to be born in Britain today. Yeah. Well, not that I was born today, I was born 25 years ago, and I just feel like we're going backwards now, seeing just women's safety, people just not interested in it. And I think that is really, really sad to see. And I think, are we going to throw it all away? All of those decades and decades of women fighting for their rights and their safety. And now no one seems to care about this because we're more concerned about... I feel like just generally as a society, we're moving in a direction where we care more about taking care of criminals than we do victims, on not just this issue, but many others. I mean, we've spoken earlier in the show about criminals who are a danger to society, not being able to be deported because we need to take care of their human rights. And I feel like we have a similar matter here where it's like we want to make sure that anyone and everyone, even if they're a rapist, can go into a women's bathroom, a women's changing room, a women's prison, even if that is at the expense of women's safety and means that more people get raped and abused. And then, of course, they simplify the argument. They say, oh, what, are you saying that every single trans person is a rapist? And it's like, of course we're not. Stop straw-manning us and making us look like bigoted idiots when we're not.
Because we're now about to enter Pride period, brace yourselves, there's rainbow flags coming at you whether you like it or not. And, Debbie, I think me and you share a very similar approach when it comes to Pride, that we don't really treat it very seriously, and we don't pay attention to it at all. We actually think there's a lot of problems with the Pride movement and, the people believing that it actually means anything anymore. I think you were saying to one of the producers here that you don't even go to the events, you don't feel welcome at them, which I find quite an interesting thing, which is supposed to be for everybody, aren't they?
Well, I don't feel welcome actually because of my understanding of what it means to be trans disagrees from the orthodox thinking on this. So it's not really an inclusive, welcoming event. It's an event for people with certain political opinions on this. But I think Pride actually lost the plot about 10 years ago when it seemed to become a corporate jolly when corporations were putting in huge amounts of money to get their sponsorship on this, and that was never what Pride was about. Pride was about people fighting for rights that they didn't have, not banks and insurance companies trying to sell products.
Oh, my favourite was always when the Telegraph, was it in 2014, 2015, they were the main sponsor of Pride, the Telegraph. I mean, at what point do you suddenly have to realise that the LGBT community sold out their identity, they sold out their people for what it seems to be nothing but somewhat of a jolly in the pub on a Saturday afternoon, bank holiday Saturday afternoon. I mean, the idea that this is a protest movement, the idea that, you know, they're really affecting change. And what is a community that has a lot of problems? There is a drug addiction problem, there is a mental health problem, there is a homelessness problem. There are lists of things that this community has to get to grips with. And yet again, what do we end up talking about? Pronouns in an email. It is pathetic, and I can't stand it. You know, they sold out. Stonewall does not represent the LGBT community as a whole anymore. And I point to the fact that, you know, they banned political parties from participating. I mean, of all people that you really want to get involved in a protest political movement are political people, don't you think, Debbie?
Well, yes, and you look back to the history of Pride when you look at the miners in 1984 who were supporting Pride. This was a group of people coming together to support each other when rights were in short supply. Perhaps now that the rights which were important to fight for have been won, and as you know, as gay people and as trans people, we need to take our place in society, get on with our work, and make our contribution.
Yeah, I always think it's the fact that, you know, it's more on the lines that people don't care that people are gay anymore that actually infuriates them even more than them not being liked or being hated. It's the fact that people are becoming different, and I think that kind of lack of purpose has driven a lot of people insane to manufacture so many issues and blow them way out of proportion. I do think that the certain institutions that need what I call the big bad. They need that evil villain, that, you know, that kind of big Bond-esque villain character. You don't say they're the ones that keeping us all down. They're the ones that, you know, they're making sure that homophobia is still a thing and that transphobia is still a thing. I am not denying that these things exist. I'm not denying that there are still huge problems. But can we have a little bit of perspective that, you know, there are still certain countries where it is illegal and you can be killed for being a member of the LGBT community. The fact that you are now, because of the Supreme Court ruling, can't use a certain bathroom, you are not parallel. This is not the same thing. And the lack of self-awareness, I tell you now, should be studied for medical science. It's embarrassing. It really is. But Debbie, I've got to say that whilst we got focused on the NHS, there is also, I think, a big institution that, you know, we have to look at, and that is the Department of Education. I do think that we have a big problem of this stuff in our schools. You know, that, you know, it's creeping in all kinds of areas, but, you know, teaching kids about certain aspects of this stuff, I'm not very comfortable with. Where do you stand on a lot of this stuff?
Well, I am a teacher, but my job is to teach science. So I spend my days...
That'll be fun for some people.
Circuits and forces of motion. That's what I do. And that's what I think teachers should be doing.
Yeah, unfortunately, again, we seem to see activists and not teachers these days. I think that seems to be a growing trend. But Chloe, again, I want to broaden this out because I do think this is part of a wider symptom. You know, when we look at this kind of the kind of lack of self-awareness, the kind of lack of understanding and putting things into perspective. Because, you know, this has been cheerleaded on by the Labour Party, and yet Keir Starmer went missing. I mean, he became a submarine. He went underwater the minute this decision came out. I mean, I know the guy likes a foreign trip and a holiday, we all do, but I mean, this one seemed a little bit of an extended visit for political purposes, but there has been no leadership from the government on this, and it concerns me greatly, if I'm being honest.
Well, I mean, this is a very difficult issue for Keir Starmer. I mean, him and various other cabinet ministers in the Labour Party have just struggled so much whenever they are asked in any kind of media round.
In a way,
what
it's
is
somewhat
a woman?
Fun. It's somewhat fun to watch them struggle. It is hilarious,
and I love watching the compilations.
Yeah.
You know, I wouldn't be surprised if him and David Lammy, they know in their own heads, they know exactly what a woman is, but they are so scared about upsetting everyone. And I think this Supreme Court ruling, at least initially, I know he was very quiet and didn't want to come out on either side, but I think for Keir Starmer and a lot of organisations that want to appear apolitical, be that, for example, sporting governing bodies, this was a bit of a sigh of relief because they're so scared because sadly we are living in an era where if you think that there are only two genders or you think that men shouldn't be allowed in women's bathrooms, that is considered a political opinion. They're so worried about upsetting anyone. I think this was a sigh of relief where they can say, you know what, somebody independent has said this and we can just say we're implementing what the court has said. But then Keir Starmer had to deal with then rumblings with his own party, hearing about people plotting? Is there any kind of legal loophole we can use to get around this?
There was the WhatsApp group, wasn't there, of all the MPs that were trying to circumvent it, and, you know, they felt really let down by this decision, didn't they?
And Labour voters, particularly the young student types, I mean, they're still over a month after the Supreme Court ruling out on the streets protesting. Some of them are, in fact, urinating in public to show their disdain about this. They are furious with Keir Starmer for not trying to overturn this. And it's such a no, and it shouldn't be like this. It should be fairly straightforward.
One thing I will say, though, is, and Debbie, I don't know what you think on this, there has been a lack of leadership so far from the kind of Equalities Commission, and, like, you know, these bodies that are supposed to be implementing a lot of this stuff, they've gone very quiet, and I think that has not helped the situation. Now, I don't disagree with Chloe that, you know, that sporting bodies have breathed a sigh of relief, but there's a lot of other bits of this that kind of need the guidance, and they need it now, and, you know, I do think that a lot of small companies seem to have been caught out with, you know, offering certain services and all the rest of it. And I think it's time for them to kind of get in the game a little bit, don't you think?
Well, yes, but the Equality and Human Rights Commission is consulting at the moment on new guidance, which I think is needed. The interim guidance that they issued pretty soon after the Supreme Court ruling was sane and sensible, and it's now up for consultation. So I think that's a positive.
Yeah, that's true.
I agree with what Chloe was saying about politicians. Yes, I'm sure Keir Starmer all along has known what a woman is. It is common sense. We all know.
Yeah.
But there's been tension within his party between different groups of activists, and between the young activists who perhaps are, you know, stuffing letterboxes with leaflets, and the people that the voters that they need to elect their candidates. So there's been all sorts of tension, and yes, the Supreme Court has given them an out on this, that well, it's not nothing to do with us. This is what the Supreme Court
that guy
said.
that's done it.
But at the end of the day, the politicians are who lead the country, not judges.
Well, I didn't really have much faith in the politicians when one of the health ministers believed you could be a llama. You know, I have to admit that this whole, because the thing that really annoys me about many of the pro-trans agenda activists come out with is the innate dishonesty. I mean, like, these people couldn't tell the truth if their life depended on it, because, you know, they're talking about, you say, about how they have to go through so many steps to recognise his certain gender certificates and all the rest of it. But what they didn't tell you is they've been campaigning to get rid of those steps. They want self-identification. You know, they're playing one card with one lot, one card with another. And, you know, I think that sense of just be honest about what you actually think, and maybe the public might respect you a little bit more. But I do think there is a big problem there when it comes to this trans lobby, for want of a better phrase, actually, you know, coming into the game with not honest intentions. But again, we see it right across the board. Chloe, when it's on this stuff, you know, the trust in politics is declining. Trust in our institutions is declining. The NHS is saying it is going to basically ignore the highest court in our land. This can't end well, can it?
No, I think it's embarrassing for organisations like the NHS. I think it's embarrassing for politicians to be so timid when it comes to addressing issues, saying what is common sense. And I think people need to have some guts. I think that we've lost the era in politics and just in society in general, where people actually had the guts to just say what they think and then not worry too much about what the outcry is. If you're a politician, and this is something that, you know, Nigel Farage, he's gained a lot of popularity just because he's a politician who just speaks authentically and says what he thinks is common sense. Now, you might not agree with him on everything, but you know that he's telling the truth and being honest, right? Whereas when you've got these kind of managerial speak politicians, it's very frustrating listening to them when you can see all that's going on in their head is, how do I not upset anyone? How do I not offend anyone? They avoid every single question that they are asked, even if it's a very simple question about what a woman is, and basic simple questions on women's rights and women's safety, that all of us are screaming, we know what the answer is, but you're just scared to say it.
I think this is such a good point. It is the fear. They are so scared of a tiny minority screaming the loudest. And actually, it's about time to say, like, you can scream all you like. That doesn't change the truth. And this is what I've always believed about this, about the trans argument, is it is about truth. Because what could have happened here is that a scientific falsehood could have been the basis of law. That is a very dangerous thing, because once you start rewriting those kind of stuff, you can start rewriting any kind of laws you like because you've set the precedent for it. People always ask me, because after doing all these kind of things, people always say, you always bang on about the trans stuff. There is a reason for it. It is truth. And unfortunately, I don't know if you agree, Debbie, but we are seeing an assault on truth right across our institutions, right across our politics and our social life. People are going for it, and it is not being defended vocally enough by the people that are elected to defend the truth.
Well, for a while, this group of activists, the trans lobbyists you call them, could do exactly as they pleased. Nobody seemed to be able to challenge them or tell them no. And this must have attracted all sorts of people. Anybody, for the last 10 years, anybody who wanted to get on a campaign where nobody could challenge you has jumped on this campaign. And in some ways, the grief that those people must feel that the party's over, this isn't happening anymore, is huge. And it's not surprising that we're seeing so much disbelief and so much, refusal to see reality. But looking at you've talked about an assault on truth. At the end of the day, we all know what the difference between a man and a woman is, and if the law is absurd, then we're left with absurd laws which are just not respected. And that's the dangerous situation.
I think you bring up a very interesting point. Sorry to interrupt, but you bring up such an interesting point, and that is about how these people have been told no for the first time. They're not used to it, and the reaction to it, I think, is going to be ferocious. This idea that woke is over, I'm not on board with it yet, because I think there's one last fight in this lot, and there's nothing more dangerous than an animal backed into the corner. But anyway, Debbie, thank you so much for joining us. Please keep up all your hard work. I am following it, and we are just going to take a quick break, and we'll be back after this.
The question has always been, how best to serve the country. I mean, I left UKIP to argue for a referendum. It was only because we got a referendum we were able to actually leave the European Union in the end. Nigel is very strong, very driven. Not everyone can keep up with him. I think you do tend to attract people from all sorts of walks of life when they're a new party. Not all of that works out.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is talk.
Thank you for all your texts and phone calls and everything. I will get to them towards the end of the show, so make sure you are calling in. The number is 0344 499 1000. I will get to all of them. Again, thank you so much for all the lovely comments about me and Chloe. It's very nice of you. And yes, this is very much of a swan. It's calm on the outside, but the inside is the feet are going, trust me. But before we get to the calls, it is time to cross the pond and talk about another political breakup. Because I tell you now, there's nothing sadder than a bromance breaking up, and that is between Elon and Donald Trump. Elon Musk, you know, he has gone off on one. I won't lie, Chloe. I think we were talking in the break about...
It's a bit of an understatement.
Just a little bit. I don't really know how to introduce this topic, really, if I'm being honest. But let's just throw to a clip real quick of Donald Trump saying how disappointed in Elon he is.
You saw a man who was very happy when he stood behind the Oval desk. And even with the black eye, I said, do you want a little makeup? We'll get you a little makeup. But he said, no, I don't think so, which is interesting. And very nice. He wants to be who he is, so you could make that statement too, I guess. Look, Elon and I had a great relationship. I don't know if we're well anymore. I was surprised because you were here. Everybody in this room practically was here as we had a wonderful send-off. He said wonderful things about me. You couldn't have nicer. Said the best things. He's worn the hat. Trump was right about everything. And I am right about the great, big, beautiful bill. We call it a great, big, beautiful bill because that's what it is. But I'm very disappointed because Elon knew the inner workings of this bill better than almost anybody sitting here, better than you people. He knew everything about it. He had no problem with it. All of a sudden he had a problem, and he only developed the problem when he found out that we're going to have to cut the EV mandate because that's billions and billions of dollars. And when that was cut, and Congress wanted to cut it, he became a little bit different, and I can understand that.
Well, you know, there's nothing worse than being disappointed. It always reminds me when your mum says, I'm not angry, I'm just disappointed. I mean, that does hit harder but, more than anything else. But I want to bring in Rick Gates, who's Donald Trump's former campaign manager, to talk about this great fallout. And Rick, you know, they always seem to be like the first buddy was Elon Musk. Oh, by the way, welcome to the show and thank you so much for joining us. But, you know, Elon, they were the best friends at one point. You know, they were the new kind of double act. But it's all got a bit sour, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Look, there's always been a scenario where we believe that Elon and the president's relationship would deteriorate at some point. A lot of us thought it would maybe last a little longer, but I think the main difference is Elon took it from a policy disagreement to personal attacks, and that is a red line you just don't cross. So,
yeah.
You know, I've been asked a lot, you know, today, can the relationship be repaired? To some extent, yes, but it'll never be the same relationship. Donald Trump has a long memory, and he will certainly remember the things that Elon Musk said. I think Elon crossed the line. Some of the stuff was inappropriate. Now he's going to pay the price for it. Yeah, definitely. Some of the Epstein accusations seemed, well, wild, I have to admit. We and Chloe, this is Chloe Dobbs, we were talking about just the tweets that were coming out seemed, I mean, the guy is a little unhinged. We always know that when it comes to Elon. But my Lord, the way he jumped in with 2 feet making these wild accusations, which seem to be very spurious, I won't lie. You know, like you said, Donald Trump, he can hold a grudge. He's got a long memory. And I don't believe this relationship is repairable. But I've always thought that this kind of the MAGA movement, I make great parallels with it with the reform movement over here, is a kind of fellow travellers. There's lots of different groups all banded together, and I can't help but notice a lot of the cracks are starting to show in the MAGA kind of side of things. You know, you always had the kind of tech bros, the Vivek Ramaswamis of the movement, kind of breaking away from the kind of more the Steve Bannons of the world. You know, but this time round, Trump 2.0, he's holding this together pretty well. What's he got different? And, you know, what can Farage learn over here? That's for certain.
Yeah, look, I think he learned a lot from the first cycle. I think when you saw the number of members of Congress and the judicial system and how it was blocking him, he learned a lot from that. Like I said, he learns very quickly and he has a long memory. And those lessons learned in that first cycle, I think, are paying dividends. I think he's equipped with more tools this time around. If you look at the way that the courts are challenging it, they are still challenging it, but he's finding ways around it. He's finding other avenues within the executive branch, within the laws themselves, to be able to go through and
and navigate, I think, more deftly on some of these, policy issues like immigration, economics, tariffs, certainly, particularly with the UK. And then, as we see, China is going to be holding some meetings in your fair city of London, starting on Monday with the US. So all of these things, I think, are a great example of what the president's been able to learn and how he's implementing that this term around.
Yeah, the one thing I've noticed about this time around is actually that Trump's moving forward, perpetually moving forward. He's not stopping, he's not apologizing, he's not bowing to the questions of a unfair press this time, And I think that's what he got wrong in the kind of the first term, was he tried to play old school politics despite not being of the old school.
Yeah, no question. And look, I think that, he's a CEO by trade. And so he thought he was going to come in and be able to kind of take that mentality and say, do X, and that X would be done. And the government doesn't work like that. It's a behemoth, it's a bureaucracy. And just even in the work that Elon's done, we saw how much waste, fraud, and abuse are in our government. Sure, you guys have it too. But those are the things that you learn along the way, and they're very hard to learn if you've never been inside government before. And part of that's the same thing Elon's going through. Elon was very focused on one issue. He wanted to cut the budget. It's a great aspiration, but there are other things that matter to the voters in our country as well. And Donald Trump represents more than just one block. He has to appeal to a lot of other different elements of the party in order to keep that power, in order to keep that re-election, where we're going to need the House and Senate. Otherwise, it's a 2-year term, and he's just going to be writing executive orders for the next 2 years.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. And, I think it's this point that we always hear it, like, oh, just run the country like you would run a business. Certain elements you can do that, certain elements you definitely can't, because, like you said, it's about building coalitions, and Trump was a master at it. Nigel Farage is probably the equivalent over here in terms of bringing these fellow travelers together. But, this time round, I think Trump's hired well. As he's not really picked the Republicans old school. He's picked some out there thinkers who are just as brave as he is about trying new things, but that comes with a sense of need for somewhat of a tighter leash. Do you think after this incident with Elon that everybody else is going to be reined in just a little bit?
Look, I think the people that are there are already loyal to the president. I think that, Elon, look, I think part of this is about money versus power and how much Elon brought. And as you saw some of the arguments Elon throwing out yesterday in incendiary ways that Donald Trump wouldn't have won without his money. Well, go back to 2016. Donald Trump didn't have that much money to run that campaign. And we certainly beat Hillary Clinton, pretty handily with a lot less resources, particularly financially. So when you look at a presidential campaign, it's like a prime ministerial campaign. There are a lot of elements that go into it. It's not just one singular thing that gets an individual elected. So I think Elon Musk missed the mark on that. And what I think you're seeing is that, especially Washington right now, it's Donald Trump's town, it's his party, and it's his agenda, and everybody is rallying behind that agenda because that's what really matters.
Yes, I always said that he didn't just win, he took control. That was the difference this time round. He wasn't just the president, he was the president. It was Trump's word and that was it. He wasn't, he's got these generals around him, he's got these advisors. There was none of that this time round. I found that very, very different. But I pick up on something you just said there about this kind of, the kind of idea of, you've got to keep everybody together. Trump is very good at that. And this time, we're struggling over here about keeping our political parties together. Everybody seems to be in the middle of somewhat of need of a marriage counselling, is what I've been calling it this evening. Everybody's falling out with each other. The kids are all crying in the corner, and somebody's got to feed the dog. It's rather ridiculous, and the country's going to rack and ruin. But Trump has been a great inspiration to so many people that wouldn't normally vote for Donald Trump or a person like Donald Trump. What do you think he's been able to inject into America that that we need over here desperately? Because I do think we need the Trump tonic, but I'm not quite sure what it is.
Yeah, I think it looks at a couple things. It's authenticity, right? And it's a great message. The one thing that even detractors from President Trump say is that at least he does what he says. They may not like what he does from a policy point of view, but at least he delivers on that. And that is something that's very rare in any politician, no matter what country you're in. So I think that's first and foremost. The second part is just really about that authenticity that he has, that factor of really being who he is. He's transparent. Look at all this playing out right now. How many other, presidential administrations would you actually be seeing this back and forth? I know the media is having a field day with it, but this is what the American people are seeing firsthand. They're getting to hear from the president directly. It's not filtered. It's not passed through different people. So I think all of those elements are really what are uniting a lot of the voters in our country to say, hey, I like this guy. I think he's going to do what he says. I like his messaging, and his messaging has been on point, for the 2024 election and up to this point. He hit immigration hard. That was a big issue for us. Economy is next. We'll have to see this big budget bill. I think what's been very fascinating from my point of view this time is normally these budget processes break down very quickly. This time around, there has been disagreement, but there has always been this idea that we are going to get something done. Everybody has consistently said, even the detractors, something will get done. What it looks like, that's what we got to get to. That was kind of a different tone, a different tact than we've seen over the last couple of years in previous administrations. So that was pretty, I think, inspirational.
Yeah, definitely. I have to admit, usually these kind of budget things, no matter which country you're in, are as dry as anything. I mean, it only interests people like me, nerds who sit at the home all day. But what's quite interesting is, is actually even the detractors are somewhat rather playing by the rules this time. I think the Democrats, I don't know if you agree, seem to have learned their lesson a little bit, that you just can't keep using lawfare, you can't keep doing this stuff, because actually they've turned into the villains. That's the thing that I think they've finally clocked onto, is that, Frankenstein was the name of the doctor, not the monster. And, I think we're starting to see the Democrats, and I think the Labour Party are coming to that conclusion over here, that, we've got to start, playing by the rules, because just because you don't like him doesn't mean you get to break the rules.
Yeah, and what we see over here, and honestly, it's surprising that the Democrats haven't been able to kind of regroup, kind of coalesce. They have no message. They have no leader right now. That's great news for Republicans. I think they'll eventually get their act together. Usually it happens much quicker, particularly after a presidential election. Usually you have kind of a succession. You see somebody kind of, come up. They're the next leader. They start with the message. You're usually in a great spot because you're on the attack. You're able to attack the incumbent at this point in time. But that's what the Democrats have lacked. I mean, even Democrats are tearing each other apart. They're very frustrated with their party right now and the lack of leadership. I don't know how long that's going to carry out. I don't think it'll be all the way to the midterms. It would be great if it would. But I think that they'll find some sort of issue or moment to coalesce. Certainly they're using the Elon Musk moment. I don't think that's going to really pay dividends for them. They're still losing in a lot of the key demographics. As a lot of Democrats say, we lost the working voter, right?
Yes, definitely. I think it's the same over here. It really is. And the left have just wandered so far away from them now that trying to claw that back is going to be really difficult. Rick, it's been absolutely great talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Chloe, just really quickly before we go to break, these tweets and this kind of animosity is at the heart of this kind of falling out between Trump. Obviously, it's Trump, and we know he's a little volatile, shall we say it that way, and obviously Elon Musk is a little volatile. But that volatility is seeping out into their supporter base. And we're seeing it again with the Rupert Lowe thing and Nigel Farage, and we're seeing it in the Tory party and now in the Labour Party. Again, the Lib Dems are doing Takeshi's Castle, so they're in irrelevancy. But, even in the SNP, they're starting to have this little pulling apart. And it is, do you think, where do you think our politics can get back into the place where we're not screaming at each other anymore? Because I don't know about you, but I'm starting to lose my voice.
Well, first of all, the screaming needs to stop, and you need to have a reasonable discussion. We all know that Elon Musk tweets very erratically, and I think that his tweets can certainly have far more of an impact than, say, Rupert Lowe's tweets or Ben Habib's tweets about the Reform Party, because, I think everyone automatically follows Elon Musk on Twitter. So they reach very, very far. I think that what also needs to happen, as well as the tone of voice, is that disagreements need to happen in private first, at least. And that was one point that Nigel Farage made when he was talking about the situation with Zia leaving, being asked, OK, would you consider bringing back Ben Habib or Rupert Lowe, is that he said you cannot, as soon as there's any kind of disagreement with the leadership or about policy, immediately go public and start talking online, because that way you just create so much tension, 100%. Not just within the structure of the party, but within your voter base as well. So just sit down, guys, talk things out.
Yeah,
you don't have
just,
Elon Musk
going to the pub and having a pint and letting it.
Yeah, I think Elon Musk, as soon as he's got some sort of problem, just immediately going online and going crazy. I think it's not a professional way to act.
Not at all.
I think it's great that we've got X as a platform. It's great that we've got free speech, and it's great that we've got people who seem a little bit more human and don't put everything out in some boring managerial statement every time they want to say something.
Yeah.
But I feel like there's got to be a little bit of control, and you've got to accept that in any party, regardless of whether you're trying to be a party with more of a single issue or a broad church. No, you're not going to have every single person in the party agree as soon as you start growing to a certain size. You need to be able to handle those disagreements in an adult manner and accept just because you've got a disagreement with the leader of your party, that doesn't mean you have to completely break apart from them. Find the middle ground somewhere, find a compromise.
When you kind of promote radical people, finding the common ground between those kind of people can be very difficult. But anyway, we are just going to throw to a break now, and then me and Chloe will be taking your calls, going through your messages and WhatsApps, and we'll see what you've got to say on all of this. Join us after this break.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to the Political Asylum that we are. I'm Peter Barnes, covering for Kevin O'Sullivan, and we are going into the final section of the show where we get to hear what you've got to say. So I'm just going to read out a couple of comments. Honestly, I am so blown away with so many of the nice things that people are saying about us, Chloe. I'm not going to be one of those people that kind of, gushes over them, but, I might ask if we could take a copy of them home. I'm not going to lie. No one's ever been this nice about me in my entire life, and that says a lot. I'm not going to lie. This one here, I have to admit, I thought was quite nice. It was, where has it gone? It was this one. It says, Peter, this is from Emily, and it says, Peter, you used to wind me up a little with your criticism of reform, but you were right. I guess I was just desperate, like so many people, for real change. Politically homeless again. Now, this is something I've always said about reform, is that they have tapped into a voter that really wants change. They want to get involved. They need change in this country. The system hasn't worked for them, and reform have promised a lot, and if they fail to deliver it, I don't know what's going to happen to this very big voter base. It could either break away and they may never be involved in politics again, or, they could be co-opted by more nefarious actors. I do think that reform really do have to deliver. And do you think they're capable of doing it, Chloe? Looking at them now, there's chaos after chaos after chaos. And we are only 4 years from a general election, and they might be a big player.
I think that I completely understand people who are starting to get nervous about reform and thinking, oh, maybe we're starting to see the cracks, especially after they've seen Zia Youssef now leave the party. People thinking, oh, God, is this just another show of people running around like headless chickens, changing leadership and changing positions all of the time like we see in the Tory party? Are these people who can actually crack on and get something done? I completely understand people being concerned about that. I think that I'm very much still, and you may be different to me on this, but I'm very much still of the opinion that anyone will be better than the Tories and Labour. And I am more, even though Zia Youssef has now gone, I am much more confident that Reform is now more organised, has a lot more staff, has a lot more structure, and is thinking about their policies a lot more. But I think that they're very much as... It's going to be very difficult if they promise the world and then they get into power and realise actually it's not that simple.
Yes.
There are constraints. There are still bureaucrats and the Treasury and everyone else that you've got to...
It's always been my big problem, is they're very good at telling me what the problem
OBR,
is.
The Bank of England. You've got all of these people to deal with.
They fight back. This is the thing. These aren't passive institutions. They will fight back. The civil service won't go down without a fight.
Exactly. And you can talk about civil service reform, but
you can. You know, how many people have tried it?
That's not something that can be done easily overnight. So I think they need to be careful not to promise the world, but I think that it's good that they show they've got tenacity and they've got a very clear vision.
Yes.
I
think they're the only political party at the moment with any sort of vision. I don't think it's quite there, but I look at Labour, they're offering nothing. The Tories offering nothing, but also the Reform Party, at least they're talking about a bigger plan. They're talking about something
the
beyond,
one party that seemed to actually have some sort of excitement about them, and that excitement will need to translate into action. I think that Nigel Farage, you know, he is great at winning votes because he is a huge personality, but let's not end up in the same situation as we did with Boris Johnson, where he got that huge majority because he's a great personality. People love Boris. I mean, the fact that he was able to be Mayor of London in a place that typically always votes Labour just shows how amazing his personality is. But he got into power, and I think we quickly realised, oh, we voted for him because he was the cool guy, not because he's actually got any competency to run the show. And it seemed very much that people were running around like headless chickens, not managing to keep a hold on things there. We don't want to end up back in that situation again, and voters are going to be furious if they gave the Tories a chance on immigration for 14 years, nothing happened. Then they voted in the Labour Party, who promised them the world, nothing happened. And let's say in 2029 we bring in the Reform Party and they promise the world, and people think, oh my God, finally we're saved. And then it's the same old show. That will devastate voters in this country.
I totally agree, but expectation management is so important for Reform now. They've got to keep a level head. They've got to stop promising the world. Because if we look at this result in the by-elections up in Scotland, you know, this is... The Reform are saying it's a two-horse race, you know, and then they came third. However, when you look at the statistics and look at the polling and the voting stuff, they've done incredibly well. This is a huge win for them in some respects. But because of how they've messaged it, it looks like they've rather dropped the ball on that one. And I think this comes down to experience. There is not a lot of actual practical experience in terms of running these campaigns, running these kind of long-term messaging, you know, because if you look at Farage, he has been a great kind of campaigner, of course, but it's been short, sharp things. Obviously, he's campaigned to leave the European Union for a long time, but in terms of the Brexit campaign, it was incredibly short. But, you know, there's nobody there to kind of keep the momentum going, keep everybody on message tightly without promising, you know, that they're going to find Shangri-La at the end of it. It is rather concerning, and I think that's where Zia Youssef was starting to fall down quite a lot, because he was going on saying, we're ready for government, we're ready for all this stuff. I was like, whoa, you took Kent Council, let's you know, rein it a little in, shall we, and actually get some solid policies together. And I do think that they need now, as their next chairman, it should be elected. I think they've dragged their feet on this issue for far too long, but yeah, we're going to have to wait and see. I think we're just going to throw very quickly, because after this, it is what just happened. It's Kevin and Samara, the lovely Samara Gill, who has been, again, steering this ship. And I think we should have a clip, if I'm right. I'm looking at the gallery, looking for help. Is that right, Samara? For a clip for what just happened? Yep. Oh my God, they actually don't have one, I'm pretty sure. But anyway, so they are on just after this, but we are going to throw to a break anyway, and then we will get to David in London and Georgina right after this. This is Talk. Stay with us.
Keir Starmer himself in the last week has talked about this country being an island of strangers. There's no better way to start to change that than to get rid of such items like a burqa, which is so distinctive and so divisive, and actually quite a threatening thing for British people to pass on the street. I was a magistrate for 20 years, Kevin. If anybody had walked into my courts wearing such an item, proceedings would have been stopped until the item was removed.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Welcome back to the Political Asylum. I'm Peter Barnes, filling in for Kevin O'Sullivan, and we come to the final section, and I do want to take some of your calls, so we're going to go straight to David in London. Welcome to Talk. I believe you want to talk about Elon, David. What have you got to say?
Hi, Peter and Chloe. Yeah, I just wanted to quickly say that if Elon Musk knew something about Trump and Epstein, why didn't he do something about it before? It seems a bit strange that when he's only out of office, that he feels it's important to mention it.
Yeah, that's always an interesting word, isn't it? When people sit on information like that, it always feels like they're kind of the holding it as a weapon, And if you're supposed to believe in truth, and you want to believe in democracy, and they're doing the right thing, sitting on information like that is very questionable. I always say this about when we had a lot of the Me Too stuff. Isn't it interesting the number of celebrities that suddenly started to come out of the woodwork with all these stories? They say, oh, it's because the environment wasn't welcome for them. I was like, no, they saw an angle and they ran with it. I have to admit, I think you make a really good, interesting point there. Chloe, on this, do you think that, I know, Gates was saying that this won't be the same kind of relationship, but do you think that they can kind of get the bromance back together? Is the band coming in?
I think that to slander Trump in that way and to say you're in the Epstein files.
Yeah.
If he just made that up, I don't know if he did, I don't know if he's had access to some kind of information, but if he just made that up whilst having a tantrum about Trump's policies, that's betrayal. That's a big thing to say. And whilst they may be able to put themselves on more amicable terms, are they really going to be best buds again?
His title of the first buddy has certainly rather gone out of the room.
And it's a shame to see, because so many people just loved watching this little bromance going on.
It was like a 1990s sitcom, wasn't it? All it needed was a cute dog running around, and we had the workings of a kind of
well, that was Little X running around.
That's true. David, thank you so much for that call. That was absolutely brilliant. I want to flick to Georgina in London, talking about Kemi. And do you think she's a little late to the party?
Well, good evening.
Good evening.
Peter. You are doing a wonderful job.
Thank you so much.
Good evening, Chloe. I want to start by saying that I do like Kemi Badenoch as a person, but sadly, she is not leader material. And I have to say that the poor girl started kicking far too late. She should have laid down her policies firmly and gone forward from there, not deviating from the plan and not taking any nonsense. The Labour Party have given all opposition parties more ammunition than a Gatling gun to bring them down in flames, and opportunities have been missed left, right and centre. Opportunities that could have brought the PM to his knees. When you start getting backbiting, division and dispute within your own party, that is the beginning of the end, Peter. And I feel that has already started within the Conservative Party. And Kemi's days as a leader of the opposition are numbered.
I think you might be right there to a degree, because a lot of people that I know who kind of move in the CCHQ, the kind of conservative corridors, I always said that Kemi was there as a kind of sponge. She was there to soak up all this negativity, soak up all this the post-election kind of fallout, and then there would be a new person rising out of it. Now, people keep saying to me it's Robert Jenrick, but I don't see that either, if I'm being honest.
I've got to be honest, I can't see a leader within that party at the moment. the next leader of this Conservative Party is going to have a monumental task ahead to regain credibility and trust. And above all, they've got to listen to the electorate, Peter, and work selflessly on their behalf. Kemi's done too much umming and ahhing instead of going for Keir Starmer's jugular. This is the only way forward, and it's going to be a long and winding road ahead.
Yeah.
There's been too much sitting on the fence. You have to be bold, state your case, and have the courage of conviction to stand by your word.
Yeah, here. Well said. You know, I am absolutely sick to death of everyone who's talking a good game, and when it comes to actually getting in the fight, rolling up your sleeves, nobody is in the kitchen doing the dishes. It is absolutely ridiculous. Do you know, everybody likes to say all this stuff, but, you know, there is nobody leading from the front. I even say this about some people in Reform, but, you know, I think the one thing that Britain needs is to kind of get that, you know, let's get some elbow grease and actually get some work done, because I think there is a lot of work to be done to turn this country around from the mess that it is in, because it's not just the last 14 years, it's about the last 40 years of just managed decline. That'll do, paper over the cracks. You know, it is just exhausting. You know, I spend most of my day listening to these people, and I'm like, you're the problem. We're asking the people that broke Britain to fix it, and I think that is where a lot of this stuff is going wrong. Anyway, Georgie, thank you so much for calling in. That was wonderful, and thank you for the very nice compliment. I want to flick over to Andy in Liverpool, and he's talking about standing up for Britain. Is that right, Andy?
Hiya, Peter. Yes,
Hi.
No problem, mate. I want to thank you and Chloe for standing up for the UK, because I've seen you on other platforms. I know what you do.
Yes. Oh, well, thank you very much. You know, I don't really see it as standing up for Britain in that kind of way. For me, it's just saying what needs to be said. The common sense aspect of stuff seems to rather go out the window. You know, we say this is the home of common sense. I do think when you walk out of these doors, the nonsense greets you very quickly. I don't know about you, Chloe.
Yeah, well, I think that me and you and others in this space, we've got the bravery to say what we think.
Yeah.
But very sadly, there are so many people who, as much as they'll send me messages saying, oh, I absolutely love what you say, thank you so much for standing up for Britain, similar to what's just been said there, is they really feel like they can't, because they will lose their job.
Yeah.
I'm very lucky to be in a position where I'm not going to lose my job for expressing my political opinions.
Yeah.
But if I wanted to, after doing what I do now, say, hey, you know what,